Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the keynote lecture by Dr. Christopher Browning, who is such a renowned scholar that I'm not sure he needs some introduction, but nevertheless, Dr. Thomas Kühne will introduce him because they are friends and he knows him for a long time. So please.
Thanks, Vladimir. Not only for introducing me, but for organizing this event, which has this morning started quite interestingly. So, as Vladimir Solonari said, my name is Thomas Kühne. I am the Strasser Flug Chair in Holocaust History at Clark University, where I also serve as the director of the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And as you have already heard today, it's my great honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Christopher Browning. Christopher Browning is the Frank Porter Graham Professor of History Emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And, well, you all know that, a giant in Holocaust history. He has published more than 10 books on the Holocaust, more than 100 articles and book chapters. 3 of his books have won the National Jewish Book Award. One of them, in addition, the Yad Vashem Book Prize, and unsurprisingly, he has received a whole bunch of awards, honors, and the like. I don't want to cite the book titles of Christopher Browning. Instead, allow me to address, in a very few words, the impact Christopher Browning has had and still has on Holocaust history. Christopher Browning has worked on 3 aspects or major aspects of the Holocaust. One is the decision-making process that led to the mass murder of the Jews. The other is, more recently, our empirical and conceptual studies on how to use survivor testimonies. And the third one is mainly the reason why we invited him today, and that is, of course, his book on Ordinary Men. Christopher Browning has studied the decision-making process, again, that led to the Holocaust, since his dissertation at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the 1970s. And meanwhile, a couple of years ago, published the decisive book on the decision-making process, and he is considered or considers himself a moderate functionalist. What that means to those who are not so familiar with it is that he focuses in answering the question, why did the Holocaust happen, on the competition and conflicts of mid-level Nazis, but integrates into that perspective aspects like Hitler's role in Nazi Germany as a dictator, anti-Semitism, and so on. So it is a synthesis of different aspects that eventually lead to a very complex picture of the decision-making process of the Holocaust. As I said, more recently, Christopher Browning has used survivor testimonies to write a history of a Nazi camp. And in that context, he has argued for taking survivor testimonies more seriously in Holocaust history, but even beyond survivor testimonies more seriously than historians have done that for a long time. Historians have been used or preferred to use documents, perpetrator testimonies and the like, that seem to allow for a better establishment of the facts of history. And Christopher Browning has shown that we cannot renounce of survivor testimonies to do exactly this, establishing facts of Holocaust history, because we don't have our sources for these things and survivor testimonies in many cases. And he has also in a very sophisticated way, shown how to use survivor testimonies without falling into the traps of distortions or biases that unavoidably occur when in human recollections and memories. Well, number 3, last not least, his inquiry into ordinary men as Holocaust perpetrators. That, of course, relates to his 1992 very famous book. And this book has established what is now called perpetrator studies in Holocaust history. And it goes without exaggeration to say that today we wouldn't have this conference without Christopher Browning's book of 1992. And as most of you will know, this book showed that not that the Holocaust didn't happen only because of a few Nazi maniacs wanted to do it, or racists, or fanatics, but it did happen because tens of thousands, meanwhile we think hundreds of thousands of individuals, mostly German men, but also non-Germans and in a few cases women, supported the Holocaust in different roles and made choices in doing so in different ways. I assume that Christopher Browning in his lecture now will maybe elaborate a little on these insights. So, Chris, thank you for coming, and thank you for serving as our keynote speaker. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the introduction, and thanks very much to the sponsors of the conference that has made this possible. Let me begin with the issue of perspective. I was born 1 week after the deportation of Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz began, and 2 weeks before Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. I shared this earth with Adolf Hitler for 11 months, and with Joseph Stalin for nearly 9 years. Following the first generation of Holocaust studies pioneers, who during the Holocaust were either young adults, like Philip Friedman or H.G. Adler, or more often were still teenagers, like Yehuda Bauer, Val Hilberg, or Charles Friedlander, I belong to a second generation of Holocaust scholars who came of age in a post-Auschwitz, post-Hiroshima world. Now clearly in the twilight of my career, I can freely admit that I have no archival research or interpretive approach to offer you. What I can offer is a long-term perspective. Thus, today's presentation will be primarily autobiographical, looking back on my involvement spanning 55 years in what we now call Holocaust Perpetrator Studies. In the spring and summer of 1969, I read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem and Ralph Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews. Following the cancellation of student deferments at the peak of the Vietnam War for my cohort, who had commenced graduate studies in the fall of 1967, I was then in the middle of a 3-year hiatus from graduate school, holding a teaching deferment that my Selective Service Board was still willing to grant. For those who don't know, Selective Service Board was a military conscription organization when we still had the draft. In the midst of the Vietnam War and the first year of Richard Nixon's presidency, reading Hilberg was for me the equivalent of an academic conversion experience. Here was a topic that was both understudied and truly important. Having written my MA thesis on an aspect of French diplomatic history in the year 1932, which was the antithesis of truly important, I resolved to change fields. Visiting my graduate advisor in the spring of 1970, I explained to him my intention to move into a field that I called, quote, the Nazi persecution of the Jews, not yet called Holocaust. More particularly, I was clearly influenced by Hilberg's paradigmatic insight that the destruction of the European Jews was to be understood primarily as a vast administrative bureaucratic process employing a cross-section of German society not the aberrational accomplishment of a few ideological fanatics or psychotic killers. For a dissertation, I wanted to study one component of what Hilbert designated as the Nazi machinery of destruction, namely the mid-level bureaucrats of the Jewish desk at the German Foreign Office and their contribution to the final solution. The reaction of my graduate advisor was threefold. First, he acknowledged that this was a good dissertation topic. Second, he warned it was also one that had, quote, no professional future. And third, he supported my proceeding anyway, because there was no fate worse than spending years on a dissertation topic if one's heart was not in it. Concerning his warning, it should be remembered that at that time there were no college-level courses on the Holocaust being taught in North America, no conferences at which to give papers, and only one obscure annual Yad Vashem Studies in Israel as a refereed journal devoted to the topic in which to publish. In short, there was no academic infrastructure that legitimized the study of the Holocaust as a field in which to specialize. I returned to graduate school in the fall of 1971. 9 months later, on Sunday morning, June 18, 1972, as my wife and I prepared to depart for my dissertation research in German archives, we sat on the porch of her parents' house and read in the newspaper a bizarre story about the arrest of burglars in the Washington, D.C. Democratic Party headquarters located in the Watergate building in the early hours of the preceding day. Ironically, just over 2 years later, I turned in my dissertation and headed west to take up a position at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, in early August 1974, several days after Richard Nixon had resigned. The eerie coincidence of the Watergate affair and my research and writing of the dissertation is not just a matter of chronological overlap. Inescapable to me were the parallels between the criminal bureaucrats of the Nazi regime, whom I was researching, and the criminal political operatives of the Nixon regime, the news reports about whom I had been following avidly for 2 years. The four most important members of the Jewish desk of the German Foreign Office were well educated. 3 with law degrees and 1 with a doctorate in anthropology. All had ambitions for a career in government, and all had joined the NSDAP in the spring of 1933 as so-called March casualties, or bandwagon Nazis, a move that undoubtedly advanced their career prospects under the new regime. None had demonstrated any particular interest or expertise in Jewish policy until they were appointed to the Foreign Office Jewish desk. 2 became professional anti-Semites, while 2 cautiously sought and eventually obtained reassignment. But while at the Jewish desk, all performed their duties conscientiously, regardless of personal disposition. Most prominent of the 4 was the head of the Judenreferat, Franz Schwarzenegger, the son of a locomotive engineer. He studied law at the universities of Munich and Rostock, passed his 2 state exams in 1928 and 32 respectively, and became an assistant judge. He joined the SA in 1932 and the Nazi Party in March 1933. With good timing, he quit the SA in the spring of 1934, just before the Blood Purge, and attended the NSDAP Civil Service School at Bad Tolz, which earned him an invitation to enter the Foreign Office. Returning from his first appointment as cultural attaché to the German embassy in Uruguay in the spring of 1940, and receiving appointment to the Jewish desk, he immediately wrote every prominent publisher in Germany requesting their titles on the Jewish question. By the summer of 1941, over half of Rademacher's library was composed of such books. He was a self-made, self-educated anti-Semite who must have been quite gratified when the foreign editor of the notorious Der Stürmer wrote to acknowledge him, quote, as a really good authority on the Jewish question. His enthusiasm for and ambition deriving from his new position can be seen in his initiation of the Madagascar Plan barely 1 month after becoming the head Jewish expert in the Foreign Office. The direct boss over the Judenreferat was Undersecretary Martin Luther, head of Abteilung Deutschland. He was an improbable upstart by traditional Foreign Office standards. a high school dropout who left gymnasium before completing his Abitur in order to fight in World War I, he had an up and down, though eventually successful business career in the 1920s. He ingratiated himself with the Ribbentrop family and was brought into the Foreign Office as an indispensable political hatchet man for the vicious political infighting of the Third Reich when Ribbentrop became foreign minister. Eventually promoted to the rank of undersecretary, he tenaciously defended Foreign Office jurisdiction and anti-turf battles, despite the incompetence of his preening boss and the declining importance of the Foreign Office after 1939. This led him, without direct or explicit orders, but with a keen sense of the regime's priorities, to ally with Reinhard Heydrich in making the Foreign Office an accomplice in implementing the final solution. A classic example of, quote, working toward the Fuhrer. As I sought to unravel the political dynamics behind Foreign Office participation in criminality, the Watergate drama unfolded. At the lower echelons of the various dirty tricks operations of the Nixon re-election campaign was a group of ambitious young men with law degrees who had come to Washington to make their career as, quote, loyal team players. That was their own term in describing themselves. Working for the White House, they felt themselves above the law. The energies and emotions and ambitions of these team players were harnessed and directed by a callous and arrogant group of political operatives of the Nixon regime, particularly the unholy trinity of Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, who again needed no micromanaging or direct orders from Nixon, merely exhortations from the boss that the re-election of the president had to be assured, and no surprises when the opposition would be tolerated. None of the above is meant to imply a moral or historical equivalency between the Holocaust and Watergate criminality. Genocide and the attempted subversion of American democracy are crimes of entirely different magnitude and consequence. But for me, the coincidence of researching and writing my thesis on one aspect of Jewish policy of the Third Reich in the midst of the Watergate scandal certainly made me sensitive to certain mundane political processes and character types they shared in common, and to the fact that men trained as lawyers do not therefore behave lawfully. One further aspect of my initial foray into researching Holocaust perpetrators concerns the sources. Most of my dissertation was based on documents from files in the archives of the German Foreign Office. Many had been selected as Nuremberg documents, but there were also many documents, such as Luther's Handakten or office papers, and various letters and drafts and notes from Rademacher's office that had never been consulted before. In addition to the Foreign Office documents, German court records comprised a second major new source. I believe that my dissertation was the first scholarly study of perpetrators to utilize entire German case records, not just judgments and indictments. Rademacher had been tried in Nuremberg court in 1951, but fled to Syria when out on bail pending appeal. He eventually ended up in a Syrian prison for being suspected of seeking double profits from smuggling weapons to Algerian rebels and then betraying those shipments to the French. After more than 2 years in prison, Rademacher was acquitted. Penniless and in bad health, he had suffered 2 heart attacks. He chose to return to Germany, was immediately arrested, and stood trial a second time in 1968. The obvious shortcomings of the second Bavarian court verdict led to further appeals and the ordering of yet another trial in 1971. But Rademacher's deteriorating health precluded a third trial. When Rademacher died in March 1973, I was permitted access to the entire court record. This was the first of many court records that I have found to be an essential source in studying Holocaust perpetrators. As many other historians have subsequently concluded, the German judicial record of conviction and punishment of Holocaust perpetrators may be paltry, but the vast evidence collected in preparation for such trials has proven to be a vital source for researchers. However, as we shall see, the ways in which such evidence, especially post-war perpetrator testimonies, should be used is still a matter of dispute. I revised my dissertation for publication and included a long footnote explaining how my approach differed fundamentally from that of the recent bestseller by Lucy Davidovich, The War Against the Jews. I wanted to alert the editor of Princeton University Press, to whom I submitted the manuscript, about one potential reader he might best not consult. That strategy failed. The negative reader's report was unmistakable in style and tone. In a forward-page, single-spaced evaluation, simultaneously scornful and dismissive, the reader argued that my work did not focus on, that any work that did not focus on Hitler as the key decision-maker, the SS as the key institution, and anti-Semitism as the key motive was inconsequential. The reader also falsely claimed I had not researched beyond already well-known Nuremberg documents, and concluded that my case study of the German Foreign Office bureaucrats, quote, cannot be regarded as providing any contribution, no matter how minor, to scholarship in the field. With a different reader, Ralph Hilberg, and a different press, Holmes and Meyer, my first book, The Final Solution to the German Foreign Office, was published in 1978, a year that coincided with a phenomenal growth of interest in the Holocaust. NBC showed their TV Holocaust docudrama. President Carter formed the commission that eventually led to the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Congress passed legislation sponsored by Elizabeth Holtzman that established an Office of Special Investigations within the Justice Department to find and expel Nazis and Nazi collaborators who had illegally entered the U.S. This dramatic rise in Holocaust consciousness within the American public was paralleled by significant developments in the academic world. When a major 1979 conference of leading German and British historians held at Cumberland Lodge in the UK and devoted to the Third Reich did not even touch upon the Holocaust, just 3 years later, a first major international conference devoted to the history of the Holocaust, organized by Francois Frey, Raymond Ravon, and Charles Friedlander, was held at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1982. I would note 3 aspects of this conference. First was the occasion of my own professional breakthrough. Weeks before the conference, Martin Brojat, head of the Institute of Zeitgeschichte in Munich, canceled due to health reasons. I had just published a very short article in Brojat's own journal, the Vierte Jahreshefte für Zeitgeschichte, replying to his claim that the final solution had resulted not from a Hitler decision or order, but emerged from local improvisations. And I was invited just weeks before the conference to substitute for Brojat with a paper on, quote, the decision concerning the final solution. I applied the concepts of intentionalism and functionalism introduced by Tim Mason at the 1979 Cumberland Lodge Conference to the historiographical spectrum concerning decision-making for the final solution. With Lucy Davidovich at the ultra-intentionalist pole, Martin Brojat at the ultra-functionalist pole, and myself as a self-identified moderate functionalist. Second, the ensuing so-called intentionalist-functionalist debate over decision-making process dominated emerging Holocaust studies in the 1980s. The next major international conference, organized by Eberhard Jäckel and held in Stuttgart in 1984, was almost entirely devoted to what he called the Entschlussbildung, or the decision-making process. Equally important, never again could the Holocaust be treated as marginal to understanding Hitler, Nazism, and World War II. And third, with the exception of one paper in Paris, Holocaust perpetrators were not yet a topic of emerging Holocaust historiography. That exception was Ralph Hilberg's paper identifying the Order Place and the Reichsbahn, German railway, as two indispensable but sadly ignored implementers of the final solution. As I subsequently published on both of these institutions, I wish I could say that Hilberg's paper was the direct catalyst for these subsequent projects. But I was too absorbed in other topics and did not appreciate the importance of Hilberg's insights about order, place, and railway perpetrators until later. In addition to the debate over Nazi decision-making, I did continue undertaking other case studies of mid-level perpetrators, the German military occupiers in Serbia, the auto mechanics of the security police motor pool and crime lab chemists in Berlin who invented the gas fan, and the ghetto managers and public health doctors in German-occupied Poland who were the primary rulers over ghettoized Polish Jews until the commencement of ghetto liquidation in 1942. While my subjects varied from Wehrmacht officers and military administrators in Serbia to humble auto mechanics in Berlin, to public health doctors in the general government, and the 33-year-old lawyer Hans Auerswald, who ruled over 400,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, what all these studies had in common was that they were based on a combination of contemporary documents and post-war trial records, the latter enriching my understanding of the former. Absent were those who inhabited the lowest level of perpetration, the rank-and-file, face-to-face killers who wrote no reports and were not listed in organization charts of officers, and thus remained anonymous to most post-war investigators. Insofar as the personnel of Einsatzgruppen and order-placed killing units were investigated and occasionally brought to trial, the suspects and defendants were officers who were well coached on the limitations of German criminal code and how to give non-incriminating testimony, and they routinely vouched for one another. With frustrating regularity, their transparently false testimonies were in turn accepted by shamelessly credulous judges, and in the rare cases in which defendants were given minimal sentences, these were routinely reduced for good behavior and captive to have been fully served in pretrial internment. Thus, even convicted killers often walked out of the court as free men. I relate this background of frustration in order to highlight why my first encounter with the indictment of Reserve Police Battalion 101 at the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Ludwigsburg in the summer of 1986 had such impact on me, why it was the eureka moment of my archival research career. Having long been stymied in identifying and examining clear moments of perpetrator choice in the existing sources, I was stunned by the account of Major Trump's offer to his men that they were free not to take part in the Joseph massacre, as well as all subsequent killing actions. And having long sought to discover the faces and voices of the actual killers, here I encountered numerous excerpts of testimony in which, in sharp contrast to the soul-numbing mendacity and whitewashing with which officers gave their exculpatory accounts, the rank and file of the battalion were describing their experiences in horrifically graphic detail. I knew that if the full court record at the Staatsanwalt, or Attorney General's office in Hamburg, fulfilled the promise held out by this indictment, I would have the sources for a case study that would illuminate many wider issues concerning low-level Holocaust perpetrators. For various reasons, I was not free to take leave until 1988-89. I then encountered an unexpected obstacle. From 1973 to 1981, I had contacted numerous attorney generals in Germany about access to their court records, and they had always agreed quickly and eagerly. In several cases in which office space was not available, they even allowed me to take home boxes of original court documents and return them later at my own convenience. With the Kohl Wende in 1982, things changed drastically. German privacy laws, previously designed to protect witnesses, were now invoked to protect those who had been investigated for committing Nazi crimes. It took over half a year of red tape and bureaucratic delay until I received clearance, and I began my research in Hamburg in May 1989. Here I encountered over 30 volumes of court records containing the interrogations, many multiple, of 210 members of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a figure made possible by the fortuitous fact that the roster of the entire battalion had survived, and most of the men had been drawn from Hamburg and surrounding regions, had returned there after the war, and were easily located. Furthermore, the interrogations had been carried out by a special commission of dedicated investigators. It had been created because so many of the battalion members were discovered to be currently serving in the Hamburg police, which thankfully was not allowed to investigate itself. Unlike so many lackluster judicial investigations I had previously encountered, the investigation of Reserve Police Battalion 101 was exemplary. I drew a number of conclusions from the evidence collected. First, the rank and file of the battalion were middle-aged men, average age was 39 and a half, drawn mostly from Hamburg and its environs. Roughly two-thirds were from the unskilled working class, who provided no irreplaceable service essential to the German wartime economy that would have earned them continued deferment. Conscripted in late 1941 and early 1942, when the age limit for compulsory wartime service was raised from 35 to 45, they were not composed of a disproportionate percentage of Nazi Party members, and there was insufficient time for extensive training and indoctrination. They were dispatched to Poland in June 1942 as inexperienced novices. By age, social background, geographic origin, and lack of training and indoctrination, they represented a group of men least likely to provide enthusiastic Nazi killers. Second, the initiation to mass murder at UCF was experienced by many of the rank and file as a traumatic and horrifying event. But with shocking speed, many of the men became numbed and habituated to the mass killing. In an astonishingly short period of time, they were transformed by what they were doing. Third, over time, the men of the battalion divided along a spectrum characterized roughly by three groups. Eager killers who learned to enjoy what they were doing and sought the opportunity to kill. Compliers who accepted their assignments but did not volunteer. And evaders who took up the major's offer not to participate in direct killing, though they continued to provide supportive actions by participating in ghetto roundups and in the cordons as shooting sites. Fourth, both compliers and evaders spoke of their service in the cordons and roundups with a sense of detachment and non-responsibility. Even the crudest division of labor, which left the actual killing to the eager killers and non-German collaborators, so-called Hibis, in the field, or to the death camp personnel at the end of the train ride, was quite effective in providing a sense of psychological and moral alleviation. Fifth, those who went along without enthusiasm most often cited the pressure to conform, the need to keep the esteem of one's comrades by doing one's share of the dirty work. Those who evaded invoked their own weakness to avoid implying any critique of the regime or their comrades, thereby insidiously validating the behavior of the killers as superior to their own. After I completed the narrative, I felt the need for a broader conclusion that focused on what emerged as the key issue. Why did individuals acting within a group do things they never would have done on their own? Why, giving the overt and explicit opportunity not to shoot, did they choose to kill? Earlier research from social psychology, focusing on group dynamics rather than individual abnormality, offered what I consider robust findings concerning three relevant factors influencing human behavior in such situations: conformity, deference to authority, and role adaptation. More recently, I have also found the concept of cognitive dissonance to be very relevant as well. I thought that the manuscript had the potential to be a crossover trade book, one recognized for its academic merit, but also appealing to a wide readership. And Raoul Hilberg put me in contact with his agent, who took it on. It is important, however, to note how little the topic of Holocaust perpetrators and their motivations in general, much less the order of police in particular, were of interest even as late as the early 1990s. 3 commercial publishers rejected the manuscript. 2 politely, each suggesting that it was a legitimate academic subject suitable for a university press in small specialized readership, and 1 quite rudely, before it was accepted by the fourth submission, HarperCollins. The very last decision was the title. After lengthy discussion with my editor, we finally settled on Ordinary Men, which seems self-evident now, as it has become even something of a cliche, but that was not the case then. When I presented my first paper on the battalion at the Holocaust Education Foundation's First Lessons Legacies Conference in November 1989, a young man introduced himself to me. I'm Daniel Goldhagen, you spooked him. Not surprisingly then, he reviewed Ordinary Men in the summer of 1992, and in our first face-to-face debate at the opening academic conference of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum the following year, he was extremely critical. My book was both methodologically and conceptually flawed, he argued. I had been duped by the mendacious German testimonies, whose problematic and systematic and mendacious nature I did not understand. And I mistakenly conceived of the perpetrators as ordinary men rather than ordinary Germans, who were the carriers of a unique German eliminationist anti-Semitism imprinted by a unique German culture. It was erroneous, he argued, to explain these Holocaust perpetrators' behavior in more universalistic and situational terms. In 1996, Goldhagen published Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust, in which ordinary men was discussed critically in more than 30 footnotes, but not mentioned in the main text. Beyond arguing that the Holocaust perpetrators were ordinary Germans driven by eliminationist anti-Semitism, he formulated 4 other theses. First, that anti-Semitism was the leitmotif, the red thread running through German history. Second, that the Hitler dictatorship was not formative, but merely, and I quote, unleashed or unshackled Germans to do what they had always wished to do, that is to, quote, slake their Jewish bloodlust with gusto. Third, that the final solution was best conceived as a gigantic pogrom, an explosion of hatred, of which the initial June 1941 massacre of Bialystok was the best paradigm. And fourth, that Germans were totally deprogrammed from the cultural imprint of centuries of eliminationist anti-Semitism by Allied re-education programs in the late 1940s, and overnight became just like everyone else. We then had our second face-to-face confrontation in the heated symposium at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in April 1996. Goldhagen's straightforward argument, Germans wanted to kill Jews because they were eliminationist anti-Semites, and they were eliminationist anti-Semites because they were Germans, was favorably, even rhapsodically reviewed in the initial popular press reviews, and he got immense publicity on numerous TV and radio shows and book tour appearances. A triumphal 6-city tour of Germany boosted Willing Executioners to the status of a bestseller in 2 countries. Upon returning from Germany, he dismissed all of his critics summarily. In particular, he accused me of failing, quote, to present any actual evidence and constructing my theses, quote, out of thin air. This reprehensible charge of academic dishonesty, which he later grudgingly disavowed, basically ended any further discussion between us. Only gradually, especially as critical academic reviews began to appear, did the Goldhagen luster begin to fade. In addition to the Goldhagen onslaught, ordinary men elicited a number of other critical responses and important questions relative to the emergence of Holocaust perpetrator studies. Some Israeli colleagues criticized the book for over-reliance on German accounts and inadequate use of survivor testimonies. Some criticized the central interpretive weight I had given to social psychological theories in general, as these theories were deemed to be deterministic explanations, relieving perpetrators of moral responsibility, thus making my book itself morally dubious. The use of Milgram in particular elicited from a few a knee-jerk reaction discrediting the entire book. Some criticized the book for downplaying or minimizing ideology in general and anti-Semitism in particular as motivational factors, particularly as there was a tendency to position ordinary men as a solely situational explanation in binary opposition to Goldhagen's monocausal ideological cultural stance. At least one historian questioned whether Reserve Police Battalion 101 was a sufficiently typical killing unit that generalizable explanations could be drawn from. And for some, the book was seriously deficient in not dealing with the issue of gender. I do not have sufficient time to deal with all of these issues, but I would like to expand upon 2. The downplaying of anti-Semitism in regard to perpetrator motivation, and my being allegedly duped by mendacious post-war testimonies in regard to the proper use of post-war perpetrator testimonies. There is some justice in the criticism of the book for downplaying or minimizing ideology in general, and anti-Semitism in particular, as motivational factors. It was written at a period in the evolution of Holocaust studies when debates were all too often framed in terms of false dichotomies or binaries, with the intention of Spunge's debate being a prime example. I was focusing on rank and file perpetrators, whom I did not consider then, and still do not consider, to be ideologues in the sense of Michael Wildt's book Generation des Unbedingten. I did note that comments such as Lieutenant Drucker's confession, quote, "Under the influence of our times, my attitude to Jews was marked by a certain aversion," indicated that the men of Police Battalion 101 could not have been unaffected by the constant denigration of Jews and the proclamations of German racial superiority that were so pervasive in German society. But the impact of racial stereotypes that were so omnipresent as to be axiomatic and unconscious assumptions among people who were not ideological or self-identified Nazi sympathizers deserved more attention than I provided, no matter how ambiguously the evidence spoke to that issue. I do think one of the most constructive one of the most constructive contributions to the debate over perpetrator motivation that emerged in the late 1990s was Leonard Newman's characterization of cognitive ideological dispositional versus situational, contextual, social psychological explanations as a false dichotomy. Disposition and situation are not separate. Rather, they are inherently intertwined. Situations are not static or objective, but rather subjective. They are perceived, construed, and interpreted by the people in them, shaped in part by the cultural assumptions those people bring to them. Identifying the cultural assumptions that were both more salient in German society and relevant to understanding the behavior of Holocaust perpetrators beyond the eliminations of anti-Semitism posited by Goldhagen, such as Thomas Kühne has done with Kameradschaft and Volksgemeinschaft, remains one of our research agendas. Another major criticism of Ordinary Men was methodological, that I had not sufficiently met the challenge of using particularly problematic evidence, namely post-war judicial perpetrator testimonies that suffered not only from the usual problems of flawed, repressed, and self-serving memories, but also calculated and conscious mendacity to avoid self-incrimination during judicial investigation. It was the contention of some critics that I had not taken this methodological challenge sufficiently into account and had thus been duped by my sources. Daniel Goldhagen in particular argued that the historian should not use any testimony that was even potentially self-exculpatory in order to avoid being misled or fooled by those who had been interrogated. In my opinion, the post-war judicial testimonies of the policemen can be divided into three categories. First, there are testimonies that are so obviously and transparently false that no one would use them. Second, there are testimonies that are so self-incriminating that there are no grounds to suspect they are untruthful. Third, there is a broad band of mixed testimony that does not convey all of the truth all of the time, but nonetheless some of the truth some of the time, and even much of the truth much of the time. Goldhagen and I would agree on rejecting the first category and accepting the second category. It is the third category, where policemen often did not tell the full truth about their own roles, but nonetheless provided what I considered invaluable information concerning the unit in general that Goldhagen excluded as potentially exculpatory, and I thought needed to be used carefully and critically despite the risks. I had a methodological objection to Goldhagen's position. If the hypothesis to be tested by the evidence is that virtually all members of the battalion, like all ordinary Germans, were convinced anti-Semites and eager killers, then excluding all testimony of those who claimed otherwise as potentially self-exculpatory simply guaranteed that the remaining evidence could do no other than confirm the hypothesis that the evidence was meant to test. This is a flawed methodology. Moreover, the sometimes truthful testimonies of the third category were so rich in detail that I deemed them indispensable to providing a nuanced and differentiated portrayal of the battalion. I would argue that we can put my methodology to the test by examining some of my conclusions in light of additional evidence other than the post-war judicial testimonies of the policemen. One of my arguments was that most of the men did not have to come to the killing fields as prior eliminations to anti-Semites in order to be mass killers. Rather, they were rapidly transformed by what they saw and did. Here we can look at the sequence of contemporary letters of Hermann Gieschen of Reserve Police Battalion 105 from Bremen. On July 7, 1941, after his battalion had just entered Lithuania, Gieschen writes to his wife that he is sharing his bread with two teenage Jews who had been impressed as servants for him and his roommate, and who otherwise would otherwise have had nothing to eat because he confessed, quote, "I cannot be so tough." Just 1 month later, on August 7th, he informs his wife that, quote, "Here all the Jews are being shot, men, women, children, all killed. The Jews are being totally exterminated," end quote. But his wife should not tell their daughter about this, he advised, and it was a hint of shame. Thereafter, his language and attitude rapidly coarsened. In early October, he regrets missing an execution of partisans because, quote, "it was said to have been fun." And just over a month later, when in his capacity as company photographer, he does get pictures of an execution, he assures his wife, quote, "In the future, my film will be a document and one of great interest for our children." As measured by his own contemporaneous letters, not post-war apologetics, the speed and depth of this policeman's transformation are simply breathtaking. I also argued the battalion divided into a significant minority of eager killers, a plurality of compliers, as well as a minority of evaders that constituted between 10 and 20% of the total. Goldhagen claimed that such a percentage of evaders was totally impossible, as it would have rendered the battalion dysfunctional. Here again, other sources can be brought to bear. Let us look at the gendarmerie station in Mir, in present-day Belarus, manned by 13 German policemen, including 2 NCOs, the station commander, Sergeant Reinhold Hein, and his deputy, Corporal Schultz, and 11 elderly reservists, mostly in their 40s. We know about the dynamics within this unit from the unusual testimony of Oswald Rufeisen, a young Silesian Jew passing as a half-Pole, half-German, who served as Hein's interpreter and had absolutely no motive for providing a post-war exculpation of German perpetrators. According to Rufeisen, 4 of the German police in Mir counted as the, quote, worst policemen. They were sadists who killed, quote, without remorse or conscience. There were also 4 policemen who refused to take part in the killing of Jews. Quote, no one seemed to bother them. No one talked about their absences. It was as if they had the right to abstain. And 5 policemen Rufeisen characterized as, quote, passive executors of orders. For them, quote, the whole business of anti-Jewish moves, the business of Jewish extermination, they considered unclean. For them, a confrontation with partisans was a battle, a military move. But a move against Jews was something they might have experienced as dirty. In short, the gendarmerie station in Mir exhibited the same tripartite division that I concluded about Reserve Police Battalion 101 from the post-war testimonies, but with even a higher percentage of evaders. In the decades since the Goldhagen controversy ran its course, other developments in perpetrator studies have, of course, continued. The histories of individual police battalions, order police indoctrination training materials have proliferated. Our awareness of the perpetrator role of many other hitherto obscure institutions and their personnel has expanded. The role of gendered behavior, including male rituals of alcohol consumption, as Ed Westerman's recent book has shown, as well as women perpetrators themselves have been studied. And the vital role of non-German collaborating perpetrators has been recognized, if not yet fully studied. What I'd like to explore more thoroughly are the contributions of Harald Welzer and Thomas Kühne, who examined the more elusive issues of the cultural and social milieu in which these policemen operated. They posed and helped answer 2 key questions. Why were so many of them willing to do what they did not want to do? Why did these men not consider what they were doing as either illegal or immoral? In his study of Reserve Police Battalion 45, Welzer argued that the Nazi regime succeeded in moving the moral normative frames of reference, that's his term, in Germany both quickly and totally, thereby redefining the community of human obligation from one of the inclusion based on Enlightenment notions of humanity, to one of exclusion based on racism and anti-Semitism. The exclusion of Jews from the community of obligation and everyday social practice had become pervasive long before the mass murder began, and thereby allowed Germans to decouple the dispossession and murder of Jews from any sense of criminality or immorality. When confronted with their killing task, they did not have to overcome moral scruples, but they still had to be acclimatized to what they were doing. They passed through a professionalizing and normalizing process that transformed mass killing into work. And that was unpleasant, even repugnant, but no cause for feeling personal guilt. I agree with Welser's embrace of Helen Fine's classic notion that genocide depends upon excluding victims from the community of obligation, and that this had occurred in Nazi Germany. But I do not think the shift in Germany's, quote, normative frames of reference was as total or rapid as Welser suggests. Many Germans, I believe, thought they could both cling to their old moral norms and embrace National Socialism at the same time. They could be good human beings and good Christians, as well as good Germans and good Nazis. Most traditional moral leaders, especially in churches, shared and endorsed the solution, and intentionally refused to confront their flocks with the obvious contradictions or to force a choice between traditional Christian morality and Nazism that they feared they would lose. Virtually no one wanted to accept the stark clarity posed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that one must either strive to sustain Christian Western civilization and work for the defeat of the Nazi regime, or support the Nazi regime and bring about the collapse of Christian Western civilization. As late as 1938, Germans could remain indifferent to and even embrace the legal and social exclusion and that economic dispossession of Jews carried out in a cold and orderly manner, but still be disturbed by the unruly violence and wanton destruction of property of the November pogrom. Between 1938 and 1941, however, the situation in which Germans found themselves changed significantly. Still at peace in 1938, Germany was not only at war in 1941, but venturing upon a titanic struggle and war of destruction against the Soviet Union. Germans who were observers in civilian clothing during November pogrom were participants in uniform in 1941. In 1938, they stood on German soil. In 1941, they were deep in occupied territory of primitive Poland or Bolshevik Soviet Union. In 1938, the targeted victims were assimilated German Jews and former acquaintances, neighbors, colleagues, customers, and clients. In 1941, the targeted victims were strange and alien Ostjuden. Such fundamental changes had to alter the way in which ordinary Germans would perceive and understand the situation when sent to the East. Nonetheless, nothing quite prepared newcomers for what awaited them. When middle-aged Hamburg policemen and Reserve Police Battalion 101 were suddenly confronted with perpetrating mass murder of Jews at UCF, they experienced considerable distress, disorientation, and trauma, what social psychologists would call extreme cognitive dissonance. They now had to make the unavoidable moral choice that they had evaded making until then. Most followed the path of conformity, obedience, role adaptation, and acceptance of the regime's moral norms rather than the lonely path of moral autonomy. Rapid habituation and brutalization followed. Thomas Kühne has noted that anti-Semitism, anti-Bolshevism, and anti-Slavism were important ideological factors in explaining the genocidal behavior of policemen and soldiers, but argues in themselves that they were not a sufficient explanation. Also crucial were the myths of Kameradschaft and Volksgemeinschaft, which were the lenses through which Germans saw the world, constructed their reality, and derived the moral framework that in turn shaped their behavior. These concepts had deep resonance in German society, and the Nazis successfully appropriated both of them by purging them of their universalistic and inclusive aspects and permeating them with exclusionary racism. The emotional power and need for belonging embodied in these two myths and enabled the Nazis to preside over a moral revolution that elevated loyalty to and standing within the group to the new moral fulcrum of German society. It was the group, not an abstract ideal or an individual conscience, that, quote, claimed moral sovereignty and impelled ordinary Germans in uniform to commit terrible crimes rather than suffer the stigma of cowardice and weakness and the social death of isolation and alienation vis-a-vis their comrades. This dynamic was only reinforced by an ethos of masculinity among soldiers and policemen that validated toughness, as well as the bonding effect and mutual thrill of committing transgressions together. Kühne also notes that this moral sovereignty of the group led to what he calls the, quote, morality of immorality. Its tremendous power to simultaneously coerce killing and transform that killing into a seeming moral obligation can be seen in the exhortation of General Franz Wehrmann in September 1941, when he ordered his troops to carry out a savage punishment expedition, or Strafexpedition in Serbia. This is a particularly illuminating episode since it involves an Austrian general, the Wehrmacht, in which the troops there were composed mostly of recently conscripted, poorly trained, older Austrians, reminiscent of German Reserve Police Battalion 101, rather than the SS, and Serbian rather than Jewish victims. So we have Austrian general, army, non-SS, and Serbs rather than Jews. The goal was, quote, to hit the whole population most severely, Berman stated openly, thus clearly erasing the combatant, non-combatant distinction so vital to establishing moral limits in war. He then faithfully added, quote, anyone who wishes to rule charitably sins against the lives of his comrades. To not take part in the killing, therefore, was not only an antisocial act of selfishness, leaving the dirty work to others. It was an allegedly immoral act, risking the lives of one's comrades. In this inverted moral world, killing was not only not a crime, it was a moral duty, and not to kill was a sin. The final recent contribution upon which I would like to conclude my remarks is sociologist Stephen Kuhl's Ordinary Organizations, Why Normal Men Carried Out the Holocaust. Kuhl refreshingly acknowledges that sociology faces the, quote, common accusation that it merely restates in complicated words what has already been said elsewhere in simpler ones. He then provides what, in my opinion, is a very apt example. He deems my typology of eager killers, compliers, and invaders as, quote, far too simplistic, and then presents his own alternative typology of, quote, engagement, neutrality, and distance, which I find more generic, less descriptive, non-content specific, and altogether less useful than my own terms. He argues that informally enforced expectations within a normal organization, like Reserve Police Battalion 101, can harness people to work toward a common goal, even without common motives, and that there is, quote, leeway for non-compliant or deviant behavior, even within coercive organizations, if done without challenging the morality of comrades or the legitimacy of the organization's goals. I do not disagree with these conclusions. In fact, they are entirely congruent with observations I made in Ordinary Men. Nonetheless, Kuhl relentlessly asserts that in contrast to sociological systems theory, that the usual historical and social psychological viewpoints, among other disciplines, have produced mere insights in the form of lists of accumulated explanatory factors, but no comprehensive framework as to how these factors relate to one another. History, characterized as anecdotal, fact-finding, and narratively constructed, should, he implies, defer to the majesty of sociological systems theory. I respectfully disagree. I would note that until recently, sociology's contribution to perpetrator studies was exhibited mostly in the varying notions of bureaucracy on the one hand, and Zygmunt Bauman's concept of pathological modernity on the other. Neither particularly useful for understanding perpetrator motivation in the distinctly non-bureaucratic, non-monitored Holocaust by bullets. If Kuhl's contribution represents progress in this regard, I would argue that it constitutes a step backward in another way. As I noted earlier, while the intentionalist functionalist controversy has been very fruitful in stimulating research on decision-making, it has hindered perpetrator research. Intentionalists focused primarily on Hitler and other ideologues. Insofar as ultra-intentionalists like Vladimir were interested in low-level German perpetrators, it was to characterize them virtually all as simply little Hitlers driven by anti-Semitism. The functionalists shifted the focus from Hitler and the ideologues to the political structures and functions that shaped popular behavior in the Third Reich, while perpetrators themselves remained faceless and anonymous, acted upon collectively by impersonal forces rather than being individual actors. What we do not need now, in the form of a singular focus on organizations as seen through systems theory, is a step backwards towards faceless Holocaust perpetrators manipulated by impersonal organizations. In conclusion, I would briefly note that I'm gratified to have been asked to speak before you this afternoon, and especially that more than 3 decades after the initial publication of Ordinary Men, it has remained useful in the classroom and relevant to the debates at the core of Holocaust perpetrator studies. I can share with you the good news that it has now sold over 500,000 copies worldwide and been translated and published in 20 different foreign languages. And that's where I finish. I leave this task to you, and I wish you all the best in carrying forward this vital scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I have heard earlier accounts of yours and engagement with the critiques of your book.
Please take my.
Thank you, Chris, for this wonderful lecture. I have heard earlier engagements of yours with your critique, but that's doubtfully the most thorough and most sophisticated one I have heard so far. Thank you. I think we have time for questions and answers or comments, please.
Hello. So I was just wondering, like, when it comes to just this whole talk about, like, the perpetrators of the Holocaust and just in general, from what I understand, they seem to, like, when they were, like, in a group, so it seems like they didn't see the immorality of their actions, but once they were, I guess, outside of that group mindset later on in life, did they seem to be, like, reflective of their actions? Is this true, or?
Maybe
I think you have to.
we're going to have to do another Russian. I wouldn't say they're terribly reflective of their actions as individuals later. I'm often asked, after, in the post-war period in particular, one, did they have post-traumatic stress syndrome? How did that last? And two, did they express remorse, penitence? Obviously, note to both of those. What was remarkable is between 1945 and until the investigations started, they seem to have been able to repress all of this very deeply. They were in a society that was repressing it together with them. That is, Germans in the immediate post-war were all reinforcing one another. We were the victims, not only of the Allied bombing, the Red Army rapes, and whatever, but also the Hitler dictatorship. We were double victims, and poor us. And so you're not investigating your own guilt. However, once the interrogations began in the mid-60s, I remember vividly one policeman now coming back in for his second day and telling the interrogator, I hadn't thought about this for years. Now that you're forcing me to think about it, I'm having nightmares. And so it started to come up. In terms of were they remorseful, the answer, no. Overwhelmingly, the tone of the interrogations is self-pity. Poor me. In the 1940s, I was sent to do the dirtiest work of the Third Reich. I got such a raw deal. I came home, couldn't talk about my good war stories, and then 20 years later, they changed the rules, and the law says I'm a criminal, and puts me in the dock, and I'm on trial. I've been screwed in the 40s, and I was screwed in the 60s. Poor me. There's never a word of remorse about the victims. It's all about themselves and what terrible things happen to them.
Hello, I've been asked to introduce myself. I'm Emilia Lyons, and I'm a 20th century European historian that works with Vladimir here at UCF. And I so appreciate your work, and I'm so pleased to be here today. I invited my students and offered extra credit, and I told them that this would be the equivalent of seeing a historical rock star, so pardon the fangirl moment in my question. I want to frame my question in teaching, and I think much of your work, along with other scholarship of Holocaust studies, has played a key role in my teaching, and in particular in a methods course that I've been teaching as long as I've been at UCF. And there are certainly lots of reasons and lots of uses for the reading that the students do in my class, but I want to focus on one in a question, and I think that your work helps students to really be introspective about the moral questions, and much of the latter part of your talk was about these moral questions, both in history and I think in their own lives, and in forcing students to think about these choices not as so distant, and certainly, part of that is the Goldhagen debate and why your work really has stood the test of time and his has not. I think that it makes us question our own decisions, not only if we were there then, but when we make choices in the here and in the now. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about how you engage in your own classroom with these kinds of questions.
Certainly in terms of my writing, I'm trying to focus on issues of choice. In terms of classroom, I should say that the first time after Ordinary Men came out and I assigned it was the worst class I've ever taught. I came in thinking, oh, this will be interesting, and my students couldn't say a word. It was so uncomfortable. And so, as long as I was teaching the course directly at Pacific Lutheran, which is a small teaching college, I didn't use the book again. Once I went to UNC, my grad students said, I explained this to them, and they said, well, we could do it in the TAs. You can't be in the room. It was a strange thing that paralyzed the students when I was, as their instructor in a small class setting. So I don't teach the book myself to my students. My TAs have done it, but I have not. But I certainly hope that it would become a very good classroom book, that it would bring up the kinds of questions that would bring students in and be important. I would also note the book has been used at all three of the military academies at one time or another, which I'm very grateful for, that it's been instrumental in trying to professionalize our own military in terms of what they have to be conscious about. And then obviously I think education is one of our best weapons against the issues that we're facing. We're going to spend our whole life in this profession. There's a number of good books one can use, but I'm glad Ordinary Men is one of them. I don't know if that helped answer your question or not.
So, Chris, my question is to put on a provocation, to prognosticate a little bit here. Some have said the Holocaust moment, you talked about the growth of Holocaust interest and in our field, but some have said the Holocaust moment is over, or it's it's lessening. Could you give us a kind of forecast in the future? What do you think about the state of the field of Holocaust studies in the next 10, 15 years? And also, what do you think about the state of the field of perpetrator studies? It's either tied to that or independent of the study of the Holocaust.
I would say it's not that Holocaust studies has peaked, but that we are constantly trying to reframe the wider context in which it was in. When I started, Holocaust was what Germans did to Jews. And it was a Germanocentric thing. Increasingly, we thought the 1980s, that's other victims. Euthanasia became a big study in the 80s. And then the war of destruction in the Soviet Union. And so it was, which ultimately became for the Holocaust Museum, Wiesel's famous dictum, all Jews were victims, but all Jews were victims, not all victims were Jews. And so we have to get the big nomenclature. And then there was the issue over Holocaust and genocide. How do we compare this, and can we compare it? And there was initially resistance that the Holocaust had to be, quote, uniquely unique. You couldn't compare it, and whatever. And then we realized, well, even people who were saying it's very singular and different from others can only do that on the basis of comparison. Even Stephen Katz, the most arguer for Holocaust uniqueness, argues for it on the basis of comparison. And disputes over how you define it. If you take Stephen Katz's definition, it follows logically. If you don't accept his definition, you don't come to the same conclusion. And so we developed it basically, and so we had journals like Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the museum itself. Then we began to discover, well, this was a European phenomenon in terms of the Holocaust itself, and that we have all sorts of perpetrators out there that aren't even German. And we discovered Eastern Europe, and then we discovered we not only had to talk about politics from above, but we had to get down to the village level. We went eastward and downward, from Yavava to Buchach to whatever. So I think that evolution will continue. I mean, we have lots of perpetrators that we don't know much about. We don't know much about Ukrainian militia, about Latvian militia. We don't know the unique constellation of what is often a 4 or 5 cornered ethnic configuration, whether it be Romanians and Transylvanians and Germans and Jews, whether it be Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and Russians, or whatever else. But each of these explosive mixtures you find in one place after another, there's still a lot to map out. So I think, and now of course we're getting into, well, colonialism. How does this deal with, and what light does Nazi colonialism shed on, and what light does European colonialism shed on Nazis, and to what degree is the Holocaust within that framework, adjacent to that framework, parallel, side by side with it. So new issues keep coming up that expand the context and framework. So I think that's the process we're going to see. I don't think it's going to go downhill and be ignored. I think we're going to continue to expand the framework within which we find new questions. I hope that's...
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Natalia Alexion. So in a way, Chris, you already kind of touched on what I wanted to ask. I was wondering, when you read Jan Grabowski and John Paul Himka, historians working, among others, working on these other police forces, the non-German police forces, and their involvement in complicity, perpetration. How did it sort of make you return to your own work on German police battalion? And I wanted to say also in my class, 90 students wrote a response paper as in book notes on ordinary men, and they all complimented you. I'm happy to share with you some of the examples, but it was interesting, apropos the question you just asked, that they engaged very much with the choices, and then a lot of them came back with, I still don't understand how people did it, which I think is a wonderful trajectory.
I think that simultaneous, I still don't understand how they did it, but I do understand it was done, and it was done by normal people. So potentially, in that situation, I could be faced with that kind of choice, and I have to have enough humility to know that I don't know what I would do. Yeah, so if students come away with a sense of humility and uncertainty, then the book is succeeding. It doesn't have a simple answer, but even if it does that, In terms of bringing in the other non-German perpetrators, of course, I don't have the languages to do the Ukrainian and the Polish, which I did. I think that's one of the most exciting new areas to look at, is to try to get down to the non-German perpetrators in greater detail. But I would say one of the most interesting experiences I had was when I was at the United States Holocaust Memorial in 2002-2003. And another visitor at that time was a man from Rwanda, who was a psychiatrist. As a psychiatrist, he was half Hutu, half Tutsi. He had one sister, he had 6 sisters, I guess. One had been killed as a Hutu, one was in jail as a Tutsi genocidaire. So his background was just absolutely in the middle of as you could possibly find. He had gone into the refugee camps at the Ugandan border to try to deal with survivor trauma. And then in that town there was a prison for genocidaire. And so he said, well, this is a unique opportunity to use my own profession to not just to work with the victims, but to work with the perpetrators. And he got permission to go into the prison. And he put out a questionnaire in which he asked the prisoners to self-report their degree of involvement and how intensely involved. So he had, I'm sure there were some people who were deeply involved and denied it, and they weren't in the pool. But presumably nobody confessed to being a deeply involved genocidaire if they weren't. So he had an incomplete but pure sample of people who were self-admitted, deeply involved killers. And then he gave them a second questionnaire in which he tried to think of every kind of question that would touch on any possible kind of motivation. And he said when it came back, it was unlike any survey he'd ever done, that almost all of them were flatline, no correlation, and there are 2 clusters of questions that just exponentially left off the page. The first cluster of questions dealt basically with how they viewed their victims, which was they had dehumanized them. They were not within their moral world. They were vermin, they were cockroaches, sanitation. They weren't committing murder because the people they killed weren't human beings. And so dehumanization, the ideological framing of what they were doing was one key. And the second was issues of self-esteem and esteem within the group. Were they considered leaders and models and go-getters and admired by their comrades? Did they do their share and more? And so there's 2 clusters of the dynamic of the group on the one hand and the ideological framing and putting their victims not only outside their moral world, outside the human world, were the 2 things that just left off the page. Which, for me, was funny because it seemed to be very close to what I was coming to in terms of looking at Nazi perpetrators. So most genocides, we just don't know much about the perpetrators. Rwanda was a case where we have some things, and it seems to, in terms of grassroots killers, face-to-face killers, that the pattern seems to hold.
I held a talk with you, I think a year and something ago, in Romania, where I talked about like Holocaust in general and functionalism and intentionalism, and I mentioned a bunch of key books on which people who are not necessarily in the Holocaust field read, and I mentioned obviously yours and others, and I also mentioned as opposed to this in terms of views and gold names. And afterwards, a bunch of people came to me and asked me details about the books, and much to my surprise, the majority of them asked about Goldhagen's book. Most of them, these people were involved in politics or politicians or students, mostly asked me about your book, for example. And talking to them, I realized that, I asked them, why are you so interested in Goldhagen's book, right? It's because it offers the simpler explanation, right? The most appealing to them. So my question would be, do you think that, at least for some people, simpler or more radical explanations are more appealing why are we interested in phenomenon, then for let's say something that can be more complex than, or more moderate or more on complex notes?
Yes, I think getting something that you can get your hands around and it seems very straightforward is certainly one attraction that the book had. I think for your audience, this is the Romanian audience.
Yeah.
I think another attraction, of course, is that this is what the Germans do, not what Europeans did. And Holocaust was a European project. And isn't it nice to know, oh no, only Germans did that. So that's a comforting sort of approach as well. But there were other factors, I think, in terms of why the book had this sort of brief, very big thing and then kind of fell off the map. It didn't have, had a spectacular but short shelf life. At that point, when this was coming out, was when, in fact, we were expanding the Holocaust and looking at other victims. And we were beginning to look at other genocides. So both the issue of comparative genocide and other victims were coming up. And at least within an American Jewish audience, I think one of the reactions was they're diluting my Holocaust. They're taking this away from the real victims, is being diluted. And here Daniel Goldhead saying, no, this is what Germans do to Jews because they are anti-Semitic. And so it returned the focus to what they thought was the core and the essence, and it was saying all this other stuff is peripheral. The bigger mystery, in some ways, is why was it a bestseller in Germany? Because after it had a big splash in the spring of '96 here, and then he went on his tour of Germany in late summer, early fall of 1996. 6 cities they sold out the Munich Philharmonic, and big, you know, and I read one account of describing one of the meetings. I said, this isn't a history lecture, this is a revival meeting. This is, you know, come on down and confess your sin and you're all forgiven. Come and buy my book and it shows you're not like your grandparents. And it's absolving. And so I think for younger Germans, it was, in a sense, a way of marking a kind of self-flagellating, but also, you know, I'm beyond what my parents and grandparents did. I remember I had, in the following spring, there was a conference in New York, and a woman from Munich at some research institute, PhD, and we made some simple comments, and so we got nodded, and we said, let's go to lunch. So we had lunch, and talked about other things, and finally, in the end, inevitably, the Goldhagen thing came up, and she put her hand on her heart and said, I gave my heart to Goldie. And my jaw dropped. No, I can say, what? But it's such a flawed book. This had nothing to do with the book. She took the little gray-haired German men and stuck their face in the Holocaust and made them admit they did it. It was an emotional, generational rage that this was a catharsis. So I think there were a number of different emotional buttons that were pushed that made it, somehow the constellation just kind of came together in that moment to make the book such a splash at the time, but they didn't have staying power, and then after a while, the kind of magic wore off. But there were a number of reasons why different constituencies were attracted to the book.
Hello, my name is Haley. I had a question about applying morality. A big discussion I've heard in a lot of different classes I've been in, less so discussing 20th or even 19th century history, more so things that are earlier that we have a bit more time removed from, is about whether or not we can apply modern morality to what has happened in the past. And the Holocaust is something that so many people agree is a huge, terrible tragedy, genocide. And what do you think that
essentialness of preserving democratic government and human rights is the counterexample of what happened with Vladimir. I happen to, my personal belief system is, yes, human rights are exactly what makes a better society, a more livable society, and studying the vulnerability of them is part of what a historian does. But the second issue is, what was the conception of morality of the killers that made them think what they were doing was not immoral? And so we also, the historian is always doing two things at once. Looking with hindsight from the outside back at what happened, because we can see things in ways that people there couldn't. But also putting ourselves in their place to try to see the world as they saw it. And it's those two things bringing together that really is what the historian does. So I think we look at this both from our own moral perspective, but we also try to understand what their moral perspective was and why it was so skewed and what happened when it does get so skewed. So I think in a sense there's two moral questions that we always raise. One was our morality, about which we view this from hindsight, and secondly, trying to understand them. And here's where I say what we need is not sympathy but empathy. That is, we don't join in their feelings, but we do have to put ourselves enough in their place so we can understand why they thought that way, and make them understandable human beings.